evening. I'm Rachel Brody. I'm the Chief Jewish Officer of the JCC of San Francisco, and I want to welcome all of you. We appreciate that you're here joining us for the Manaville Conversations 2012. And we're hoping that this will be more than just a thought-provoking conversation. It has a lot of potential to inspire action. We'll see what happens. This program is produced through the generosity of the Laszlo N. Tauber Family Foundation, and specifically in memory of Ingrid Tauber's maternal grandfather, Alfred Manaville. The JCCSF, because of this gift, has been able to bring Nicholas Kristof, Casey Parks, and Adam Hochschild together tonight for a conversation that's going to start in a couple minutes. What you may not know is that about 80 people in this audience tonight are already in the middle of a conversation. For the last 2 hours, we've had about 70-something teens and about 10 of their faculty who have been doing from 6 different San Francisco high schools who have been having a teen summit working on issues of human trafficking and learning, studying. It's been peer-led. It's been a really interesting and amazing event. And they did this in preparation for coming to hear tonight's program. I suppose a place to start, though, is to say a few words about the Manaville and Manaville conversations. A number of you have been asking, and it's important to know that this is a program that, well, it's in memory of a man who was born in Hungary in 1880. He was a successful banker, he was a very generous philanthropist, and he was a Hungarian national and a patriot. And like many of his compatriots who were born sort of at the wrong time and the wrong place, when the Nazis rose to power, he was stripped of his property, his businesses, his Jewish identity, his national identity, and ultimately his life. And as a way of honoring his memory, we have this annual event that's become one of our signature programs. And we're very grateful for the support of the Tauber Family Foundation that makes this possible, and also like to add a little bit of, a shout out, some special thanks to the Lehrhaus Judaica, who are our partners in this program and many others. Couple quick housekeeping things before we get started. Please turn off your cell phones, and please note that there is no photography or recording devices of any kind that's allowed during the program itself. And there's emergency exits. Also, if you need to exit the program in the middle, you need to either exit the way you entered or up by the balcony. Just take a moment to look around you and see where those exits are. After the conversation, we'll have some questions and answers from members of our audience. And then we hope you'll join us in the Patrick Family Atrium, where we'll have a dessert reception and book signing. Books by both Mr. Kristof and Mr. Hochschild will be for sale in the lobby by our local independent bookseller, Green Apple Books. So, to the program itself. I want to start, just open things up with a short parable that appears in Mr. Kristof's book, the book that he co-authored with his wife, Cheryl Woodan, called Half the Sky. I imagine many of you are familiar with it. There's a parable that he tells. It's a very short one, maybe familiar to you from this or other contexts that I want to just use by way of introduction. A man goes out to the beach and sees that it is covered with starfish that have washed up in the tide. A boy is walking along, picking them up and throwing them back into the water. "What are you doing?" the man asks. "You see how many starfish there are? That's not going to make a difference." The boy pauses, picks up another starfish, throws it into the ocean, and says, "It sure made a difference to that one." You know, unpacking that parable, we sort of have the three characters, right? We have the boy who throws the starfish, we have the man who witnesses the act and asks questions, and the one who recounts the story itself for us. So typically, the boy is identified with an activist, right? Taking the starfish one by one, trying to return it to its ecosystem, its proper place, trying to make a difference. And the man who observes this is the journalist, right? Witnessing, questioning, and then leaving it to us as readers, essentially to unpack for ourselves and to take this quote-unquote objective description of something he encountered and to extract some kind of call for action, but to do the work ourselves, to figure out what exactly does this mean? What could this be asking us to do? But in advocacy journalism, which is the topic of tonight's conversation, the reporting is factual, but the bias is explicit. All the characters in that parable are conflated. They become one. The reporter is witness, questioner, listener, activist, and storyteller. Nicholas Kristof has been throwing starfish one column at a time for the last 30 years, and the results are measured in ways that are well documented. He has able to impact in a positive way lives of individuals, the health of communities, and even the legal and otherwise intransigent aspects of various nations. But in fact, the thing that can't be measured is the extent to which he inspires others to be able to basically decide to throw a starfish after reading his columns. And what we're hoping tonight is that in this, I can actually quote to you, many of you have already looked at, you got a handout that has the winning essay. Casey Parks, who's with us tonight, was one of 3,800 applicants to join him on a reporting trip to Central Africa. That was 5 years ago. And one of the things that Casey Parks says is that she hopes that after reading these works, that she'll be able to write in a way that people's hearts will be broken so adeptly that they'll move into action. That's what she hoped to learn from him on the trip 5 years ago. We brought Kristof and Parks back together to talk about their lives, their work, the world over the last few years, and they're going to be joined by Adam Hochschild. He's a fellow journalist and a public historian who's given much thought to the fine line between advocacy and propaganda, the challenges of telling a great story while conveying historical facts, and the trade-offs between accessibility and oversimplification. We're going to start with a short clip, a video that was shot during the trip that Nick and Casey took together, and it's right here. I think that means no clip. Perhaps we'll be able to show it in a little bit, but in the meantime, join me in welcoming Nicholas Kristof, Casey Parks, and Adam Hochschild to our stage.
Thank you.
Well, now, obviously, where we have to start is you two have to tell us what was in the clip that we didn't see.
I actually think it's something I've never seen before, so I was a little excited to see it, but also nervous to see my 22-year-old self.
So maybe you're relieved that you don't have to see.
A little bit.
Well, tell us a little bit about the difference between that 22-year-old self and yourself today. What that experience meant to you, how it changed you?
I think I was pretty naive and eager and super optimistic and scared and a lot of things that I still am right now, actually. But those things don't actually get much better the longer that you do journalism. But I think I know how to be a journalist better now. At least I hope that I do. Reading some of the blogs makes me cringe a little bit. There are things I would write a lot differently now. But I was just excited to go anywhere and see anything and to meet someone like Nick who could teach me how to get to those places and how to ask questions and how to convey people's stories.
Now, this was your first trip out of the United States, right?
It was almost my first trip out of the South. I hadn't really gone much above the Mason-Dixon line. And Nick likes to joke that he thinks I'm the first person whose first trip out of the United States was to Equatorial Guinea. I remember we were at the airport in New York when we were leaving, and the stewardess kind of scrunched up her nose and was like, "Malibu? I'd rather go to Malibu." At the time, I was just like so eager to be like, I couldn't wait.
One of my great memories of that trip was at one point in Central African Republic, where we'd actually gone to try to report in part about insecurity in the region and the banditry that was forcing people to flee their villages and live in the hills, and as a result, they didn't have clean water, their kids were dying, it was a huge problem. But the insecurity was basically coming at the hands of the military and who were sort of freelancing as bandits, and to pass through the territory we had to have a military escort. So it then became difficult to go into villages and or go into try to find people and ask about the attacks when the people doing the attacks were the ones also protecting us. And so we left the military convoy for a little bit and just went off without them into the hills.
He left them at the farmer's market. They were trying to buy a goat.
That's right, that's right.
And while they were buying the goat, you're like, let's go.
Let's go. But unfortunately, in this, we did find, we got very poignant reporting about people who were living in the mountains, fleeing these bandits, and somebody's child, I think, had just died. It was very, very poignant. But in the course of it, we also managed to get held up at gunpoint, and which was a good way of illustrating the insecurity in the area. But, but I remember after we, passed through that, it was, I thought, very tense. And after we passed through it, and I asked Casey, so, were you scared? Was that pretty nerve-wracking for you? And she said, oh, no, I knew you could handle it.
They're holding a gun. We got held up twice by the same people, to be fair. But the first time, Nick just rolls down the window and holds out his hand like, how y'all doing? And I was like, oh my
I didn't have y'all.
gosh. But I'm in the car. The only thing I had with me was this little old iPod, and for some reason I thought that was I don't know why I wanted to protect it, but I stuffed it down my pants. I thought that was gonna be what was gonna do me in. But then I see him like shaking their hands, and I figured he'd been in jail in many a bad country, I thought, so.
One of the important rules, truly, when you get held up at gunpoint in Central African Republic, if that should come to pass with you, is when you are held up, it is quite useful to shake the hands of people who hold you at gunpoint, because it sort of personalizes it sort of, lowers the tension a little bit, you try to show a friendly gesture.
To be fair, his ransom was give me money for coffee, too. It wasn't that scary of a demand. But we had those big bottles of water, and I remember we gave them the second time we got held up, because the second time they loaded the gun and were having us get out. So it seemed more serious to me then. But I still with my iPod hidden away, I held up the water. I was like, all I have is this water. And then you were still kind of talking to him really nicely, and that did it.
Well, and you guys were saying something to each other a few minutes ago about playing basketball with pygmies on this trip. Tell us about that.
You seek every advantage you can, Yeah.
Yeah.
There is one picture of me that Naka took that looks like I actually know how to follow through. I don't know how he got that picture, because I don't, but I think it took me about 100 times to get a basket, and when I was about 1.5 feet taller than them. And when I finally did get the basket, they all gathered around and picked me up and carried me around. I'm so proud.
This was a little forest camp in where Central African Republic and Cameroon and Congo, Brazzaville all come together, and there were pygmies who were being trackers on a project to help guerrillas there. And in this little forest camp, somebody at some point had set up a basket, and there was a basket, some kind of a ball. I don't remember if it was real basketball, but
yeah, I don't either.
So it seemed a good time to take advantage of the basket and people I thought I might actually be able to compete against.
They had the best system of tracking there. They had they'd move a twig just a little bit, and that would tell them all the directions of the whole forest. I couldn't really figure it out, but it's pretty brilliant.
Other than that, and tips on how to get through roadblocks, what do you feel you learned from this trip? Casey, because you'd not been out of the United States before. You'd grown up poor in Mississippi, but you hadn't seen poverty like this before. How do you feel the trip changed you?
Well, when we were first starting to go, a lot of people, we went on some radio shows, and a lot of people would call and say, "Why are you going to Africa? There's plenty of poverty in America." And I had been one of those people when I was younger. I grew up in Georgia and Louisiana, and then I went to college in Mississippi, and I did a lot of my reporting in Mississippi was about poverty there, and that's some intense poverty. So I felt like, for a while too, why do you need to do that? And going there though, it's pretty incomparable. And my essay that I wrote talks about growing up poor and having to pawn things, and I really thought that we were poor because we never went on vacations, or I didn't have like big houses like my friends. But when we came back from the trip and went on a bunch of interviews, I felt so ashamed to even be calling myself poor, because it's just nothing like it. And so that was a huge thing for me, but also just the ability to ask questions and keep just going up to meet people even when you're scared. We were talking to some of the teenagers earlier that the best stories that we got were when Nick would just say to the driver, "Let's get out of the car," and we'd just get out and walk around and just walk up to people and start talking to them. And that, for me, is still the best thing, the best tool in being a journalist. Like, you can go to city council meetings or wait for press releases to come to you, and those are never going to be the best stories. The best stories are when you just walk up to someone and start finding out who they are and what matters to them.
So you won the first Win a Trip with Nick Kristof contest. And Nick, you've had several since then. I noticed that the people that you take on these trips are all students, teachers, medical students. So that means if I want to enter one of these contests, I have to go back to school or become a teacher. That's a mighty high bar there.
Well, I got a lot of indignant comments from somewhat older demographic. And so last year, I decided I would have, in addition to taking a student, I would also take a I'm not sure how, a senior, I forget how I worded it, which I defined as over 60. I wanted to give myself plenty of leeway. So I took a woman in her 60s from New Jersey who was a teacher, so actually she was something of a twofer there, and she was terrific. And so I think, but this year I'm going to take just a student along. I should also say that one of the reasons I chose Casey really was to address this question of, is it worth worrying about poverty abroad when we have problems at home? And I think that we've all heard the objection that, look, we have so many problems in this country, especially after a recession, why worry about things beyond our borders? And I thought that Casey, given her own background and in her essay talking about poverty, would be a good way of tackling that issue head on. And it, to some degree, helped that Casey was herself sort of somewhat skeptical of this proposition. And I think the thing that on the trip really focused the differences, and that Casey wrote about very eloquently in terms of the differences, was when we came across a woman, a mother of three, named Prudence Lomacono, who was dying in childbirth. She had been in the village, had had no prenatal care, and a traditional birth attendant, trying to push the baby out, pushing on her stomach, sat on her stomach, ruptured her uterus. She was taken to the hospital, I think on the back of a motorcycle.
Yeah, on the back of a motorcycle.
Right? Back of a motorcycle, after she'd been in labor several days at that point. She was taken to the hospital, and the doctor and the nurses were very contemptuous of her. They were very angry at the woman's husband for talking to us and for trying to get us to help. The doctor, she needed an operation. She needed a C-section, and The doctor demanded $100, which the family, he said that the family had it. The family said they didn't. We provided the money. Then they said they needed blood for the operation, and it turned out that she was blood type A, Rh positive. The videographer and I had compatible blood types. We provided the blood. Everything seemed to be right. She was going to get this life-saving C-section that night. And this was after hours of negotiations, and then the doctor just went home. And she ended up dying. So needlessly. She's a mother of 3. And Casey wrote.
She was 24, which is just, at the time, was just a little bit older than I was. And I think, for me, that really was the turning point, because I just couldn't imagine any hospital in the United States where a doctor would just go home, or where a woman would sit in the hospital dying for 4 days because someone didn't have $100 at the very beginning. And not to mention, I mean, this hospital, it took a really long time for me to get the smell of that hospital out of my mind. I kept, like, when I would go home, I would wake up in the middle of the night and smell it, because there's no air conditioning. It's just basically like cement hospital, and there were flies everywhere, and her catheter bag had been overfilling, and she had been vomiting, I think, in the bed, and none of that was being moved, and no one was even giving any kind of like palliative care where they would just come in and be nice or ask how she was doing. And I couldn't imagine that happening. And my, like, we never went to Disney World seemed so stupid in the face of that.
You know, I want to come back to this incident because it just seems to me to be a very crucial one. But they just gave me a note saying they have the film clip now. So should we stop and watch it and then come back to this? Sure. Okay?
Hi, I'm Nick Kristof with the New York Times. Earlier this year, I told you about the Win a Trip with Nick contest. Well, we picked a winner.
Hi, I'm Casey Parks from the University of Missouri. We just got back from Africa, and we have some sad, funny, and moving stories to share.
We're here to tell you about them right now. We started in Equatorial Guinea and spent a couple of days there. Then we were in Cameroon and ended up in Central African Republic. So we were in Africa for just under 2 weeks total. It's tough traveling in these places, and you see some really tough things, like severely malnourished babies, like women dying in childbirth. And Casey managed to keep her spirits up and be fun, even when it's really difficult.
We've been hiking back to the car for like 30 minutes, including a little bit of a trek through water.
I was delighted with her journalism and just delighted with her as a traveling partner.
Nick took me to this hospital in Yokoduma, Cameroon, and we were going to just talk to this doctor about maternal mortality statistics and if he sees people. And a nurse said, well, there's a woman in there right now who needs a C-section. There's this woman, her name's Prudence, breathing really, really shallowly. We start talking to the doctor and he says, well, her family doesn't have the money, but we also don't have enough blood for her to have the surgery because she's anemic. And so I asked him, I said, well, what's her blood type? And it was A positive. And so Nick and I kind of look at each other, and Nick says, I think I'm A positive. So they immediately went to give blood. And the next morning, the doctor performs the surgery at 5:45. And the doctor says, well, even though I did the surgery, she's got a terrible infection.
She desperately needs some strong antibiotics, which unfortunately are not available in this area.
I remember walking into the room at one point. Her husband looked at me and he said, my wife is everything to me. And I just looked at this guy, and I look in his eyes, and I kept thinking, just Casey, just keep it together, don't cry. You're on this trip to show that you're a great journalist. Crying doesn't get you anywhere. You have to go back in and force yourself to just keep watching and keep smelling and keep hearing, because otherwise you're not going to get the right story. Finally, we found out last Wednesday that she had passed away at 5 p.m. I just really, really couldn't believe it. It was so easy to solve in some ways.
A lot of people have been telling us how banditry was spreading, how Darfur had been rippling out. And so we're going down this tiny little road, and all of a sudden we run right into that. 2 guys step out from the side of the road with guns, order us to stop.
Everybody said some form of cuss word for a second there because we were like, oh, no, no, no.
Fortunately, these were the wimpiest bandits around.
Before we can tell that they're wimpy, though, Nick rolls down his window and just sticks out his hand and says hello. I think him doing that really disarmed them for a second, because the guy shook his hand back, and I looked in his face and saw, this guy isn't that scary. He's
I think
more
it's a little
scared.
harder for somebody to shoot you if they've shaken your hand, you know?
Ooh, things not
Yeah,
to
when
tell your mother.
I made sure that Casey would not get shot, because if she got shot, the New York Times would never, ever let me take another student to Africa.
Nick's got an incredible amount of information in him, so I learned so much from him. I've had this idea that journalism has this purpose to make life better. One of the reasons I like Nick's column so much is because he does that kind of journalism. It reminded me that the kind of journalism I want to do is possible, and that writing is a tool to connect someone in the United States to this woman in Yokoduma, Cameroon, whom they never would have heard of.
I think the main reason why these problems are not addressed, why people still die at such a pace of AIDS or malaria or in childbirth, is that the issues are kind of forgotten. My hope on this trip is that I can expose Casey and other people to them, and then once you make a connection with individuals who are suffering from these, it's really hard to forget about them. And that then, whether it's through journalism or through student organizations or through aid work, then one can begin to address them if you're aware of them, if you're thinking about them. I hope that Casey's video blogging and her reporting will encourage other students to follow in her footsteps.
That's one thing that I can definitely do, is tell my friends it's easy, because even my writing, it's just not the same as actually being in the room and smelling and hearing and seeing. Well, that's it from us. Thanks, Nick, for this great opportunity.
If you want to check out Casey's video blogs from Africa, head to activism@mtvu.com.
So let's go back to this episode at the hospital. Here you were. This was in Cameroon?
Cameroon.
Cameroon. This woman is dying. You give money. You give blood. This is certainly not traditional objective journalism where the reporter is supposed to be just a dispassionate observer. And Nick, I'm wondering, in your life, was there an equivalent of what the trip with you was for Casey, where something opened your eyes to a wider world, and you began to realize that this was the kind of journalist you wanted to be?
There wasn't an exact equivalent, but there was a kind of journalism that sort of opened my eyes, and this was by, I never met him, but his name was Victor Zorza, and he was my understanding is he was a reporter for The Guardian in England who had been a criminologist covering Moscow for years, and then I think because of a health crisis, he moved to a village in the middle of nowhere in India and began to write weekly columns about his village and using that village as a microcosm to talk about issues of caste, of healthcare, of conflict, of gender issues, and I just thought this was an incredibly powerful way to write about important issues, but in a way that, because you had a microcosm, it made it engaging, that made it all seem very real. And so kind of ever since then, I've been looking for ways to humanize these grand tableaux and find ways of making these issues seem more relevant, basically so people will read it so that one can make a difference.
So I want to ask the same question of both of you, and start with you, Casey. For people who do this kind of journalism, who are your heroes and heroines, both practitioners today and perhaps people in the past?
Aside from Nick?
Yeah.
Well, when we were talking earlier, my favorite journalist is Catherine Boo, who has a book out this year called Behind the Beautiful Forevers. And it's set in a Mumbai slum. It's like about 220-page book, but it's pretty amazing to me that in a book about an Indian slum, that all of the characters for me were so relatable, and I was able to keep all of their names straight and like who was who, which does not say something about me. Like that's not normally the kind of thing I can do, but she just really makes them real people, whether they're living in Mumbai or down the street from me or in the next town over. And I think that's what Nick does as well, is that you're able to find something of yourself or someone that you know in these pieces, so that these issues or places that are so foreign to you are suddenly not. So she's my big heroine, I would say.
So Nick, for you, heroes and heroines in this field, and particular books that people ought to be reading?
I confess that my heroes are less in journalism and more actually some of these people out there who are just really doing things that I encounter in the course of reporting. I was in Cambodia, for example. There's an amazing woman I've written about periodically who herself was trafficked at 11 or 12, spent years in the brothels, escaped, and now leads an organization. Her name is Somali Mam, so it's the Somali Mam Foundation, and she has led it and uses that as a platform to fight the traffickers, to get other girls out of the brothels at tremendous risk to herself. She's had guns held to her head, she's had death threats constantly, and she just keeps on doing it. And there's so many other people like that I encounter in my reporting, and I'm just blown away by their courage, by their resilience, by their commitment, and I try to take some inspiration from that. So it's those folks tend to be my real heroes.
So imagine yourself being asked for advice by an American high school student or college student who's been awakened to some of these issues through reading your work, the work of other people who write like you, who's deeply concerned about questions of poverty and social justice in the world South. What can they do? First, starting from being in this country.
I guess my recommendation would be to pick one issue that, I think often people try to do too much. And so I'd say narrow it to one issue that speaks particularly to you, and educate yourself about it. But then it seems to me that one mistake that my generation made in trying to address social problems was to try to solve them, to seek some blanket solution to a problem. So it might be passing a law or getting a new UN agency in place or a UN compact, but some kind of global big major solution. And in fact, I have kind of come over time, you need some of that, but to really believe in small grassroots interventions. So if it's education, and it's sponsoring some particular kids in school somewhere, and it's not going to solve the global problem, but for those particular kids, it's completely transformative. And that is really something that anybody can do with modest effort, modest amounts of money, and it's basically the starfish. Instead of solving enormous beach problems, I'm kind of turning into a believer in individual starfish support programs.
Given that we've got a lot of students here tonight, are there particular programs and particular college or high school campuses that you can point to that you think are examples of this good starfish throwing?
Well, one, if you're in high school, as I know some of you are, my first push would be to think about a gap year between high school and college. And I think that this is a fantastic way to spend some time abroad, which you can subsidize by doing some English teaching, for example. You can learn a language. It makes no sense to learn a language in a college campus in the US. And the reason I encourage young people to travel is that I think that it's when you actually see this kind of thing firsthand that it becomes real to you, and you become a lifelong advocate for whatever problem it is that you encounter in this trip. And so, or if you're already in college, then I think people who manage to spend a junior year abroad or whatever it may be, but somewhere out of their comfort zone. It doesn't even have to be abroad. It can be some kind of a prison visit program, or working on trafficking issues, or helping kids on the wrong side of the tracks. But getting out of your comfort zone in some way. And I think one of the problems is that too many students spend their high school and college years, still in the bubble in an area that is comfortable to them. And it's so important to get out of that comfort zone. And one advantage is in the process you can usually manage to give your parents gray hair, which is good too.
Casey, you got any thoughts on this?
Well, I think these small things that you were mentioning are the best way to go. Like, one thing, I have a little sister in the Big Brother, Big Sister program, and sometimes I think I'm not doing any good at all and feel like, why am I even doing this? But I think, honestly, just being there and like being an adult who hasn't left, we've been doing it for 4 years, has made somewhat of a difference. And then
This is a little sister in the United States or overseas?
yeah, this is in Oregon, yeah, like in my city. And then also, I think if you find what you're good at and what you're really interested in, that it'll keep you involved in it. So like one thing I would like to do is work with film and teenagers and who are in bad situations, because that does empower them if you're helping them to like make films that gives them something that they're really interested in and they can make them feel good about themselves. I think that makes a big difference, and that wouldn't take going to a whole new country and a lot of money. Because for me, like, the reason I never left the country is I didn't have money. I couldn't have taken a gap year or I didn't know that I could. I didn't think I could. I didn't have the $1,000 to get a plane ticket for starters, and my parents didn't have the money to give me that. So if you have to start smaller, I think just make sure it's something that you're really interested in that you will stick with.
Let me go back to you for a second, Nick, and be contrarian for a moment. There are a lot of people out there at this point who say that development aid, the traditional foreign aid that nations of the West in particular have given to the world South, has not only done much good, but often has made problems worse by, in countries in Africa and Asia, making leaders feel responsible to those who are doling out the aid rather than to their own electorate. And there's a Zambian economist, Dambisa Moyo, who argues that aid has hindered Africa more than helped it. What do you say to somebody like that?
I think that there are plenty of problems with aid. I mean, not so much that it actually causes problems so much as being ineffective. But anybody who has traveled around the developing world, you see projects that cost money that weren't well thought out. You see a well that was put in and there wasn't a mechanism for delivery of spare parts. So this part breaks, and then after 3 months, this quite expensive well is out of commission. People go back to drinking from the creek. So I think there is a danger of humanitarians being too glib about how easy it is to make a difference. It's hard. It really is. But having said that, I think anybody who has traveled around has also seen a lot of projects that have made tremendous difference. And I think we're getting better at figuring out what kinds of projects work and what don't. And it seems to me undeniable that aid has had tremendous success in something as simple as saving lives. I was telling the students earlier that if you look at the child mortality rates that prevailed in 1960, if they had continued today, then every year we'd have about 58 million kids dying around the world before the age of 5. In fact, there are between 7 and 8 million kids who die annually before the age of 5. In other words, every year through vaccinations, through cleaner water, through a million other interventions, we're saving the equivalent of 50 million lives a year of kids under the age of 5. It's a tremendous accomplishment. Far more kids going to school, far more clean water. Diseases that, when I first traveled around Africa as a backpacking student, the thing that just broke my heart more than anything else was river blindness. And you'd see all these middle-aged people who would go blind and being led around by a child or a grandchild. And river blindness these days is largely behind us because of the good work of a bunch of people. And there's real progress being made in a lot of areas. And maybe journalistically, maybe we should do a better job of acknowledging that rather than focusing on the problems. But because I think people sometimes have a misapprehension about just they think that it's a mess, has always been a mess, always will be a mess, and as Jesse Helm said, it's sort of money down a rat hole. I really don't think that's the case at all.
A couple of questions for you both about the field of journalism. You're both prolific bloggers, and Nick, I know you do a lot with Twitter and Facebook as well. Do you feel that these social media tools are things that have changed the face of journalism in a good way, in a bad way? Do you think it makes it more possible to do this kind of activist journalism that we've been talking about? Casey, you want to
I think it's made it better and worse. I mean, sometimes I wish journalism weren't getting shorter and more digesty, and sometimes I hear at work a lot, like, our readers don't have time for that. And sometimes I wonder if we really ever ask them if they have time for that. But, that I have apprehension about. But I do think Twitter moves stories along and Facebook moves stories along that might reach people who otherwise wouldn't have been going to go look to the New York Times for Nicholas Kristof. Because I think, like, your reach is a lot different than just the New York Times reader. I mean, probably your average teenager is not going to be going to the website to look for that, but they might see nuns are cool and be like, what is this about nuns are cool? And then, so I do think for that it's really beneficial.
What are your feelings about these tools, Nick?
I think that it's kind of essential and inevitable. And I worry about a lot of trends in journalism, and one is the trend away from covering sort of hard, difficult stories a long way away. Congo is a great example. It's the most lethal conflict since World War II, more or less the rape capital of the world, and it had a major election a few months ago. No American network sent a television crew there. On the previous round of elections, Anderson Cooper had gone with CNN and really invested a major effort to report on it, to use satellite dishes to report live from Congo. And despite that incredible expense and effort and some risk, frankly, their ratings dropped that week. And I think it's pretty clear that if you're a television executive producer of a show, the way you compete is not to be aggressive in covering Sudan, Congo, crises like that. It's to put a Democrat and a Republican in a room together and have them yell at each other. And so, given that constraint, it does seem to me that one has to try to find other tools to try to convey the realities around the world and to try to do what one can to convey those realities. And I think that social media provides some opportunities to do so. In Southern Kordofan, there's aid groups in Sudan. Aid groups have all been kicked out. But there's this one young American guy who quit his aid group when it ordered him out. He's married to a local woman. He quit. He said he's staying behind, and he's tweeting from there as it's being bombed by the Sudanese government, as it's being starved by the Sudanese government, and it's a rare peephole into a extraordinary humanitarian crisis, and I think we're lucky to have things like that.
I want to just change our focus a little bit and ask you both. I think one thing that one often does as a journalist is you're writing about people who have power and people who are powerless. let's talk for a second. We've been talking about powerless people. Let's talk for a second about people who are in power. And since this is a presidential election year, I'd like to ask each of you, imagine if you were president for a day, and you also on that day had a majority control of the House and Senate. Important thing. What would be the things that you would do?
I would extend my term, but
And after that, suppose you had power to, crack heads together, make a peace deal in the Middle East, make a new agreement with Iran. What are the parts of the world you would look at, and what would you do?
I mean, in my case, after ordering mandatory subscriptions to the New York Times for all Americans, I think I would focus on education, domestically and abroad. All these issues are so much harder than they look, and there are no silver bullets anywhere. But when I look at Pakistan, Afghanistan, for example, where I've done so much reporting, and it's so depressing to go back there, then we've poured money into the military tool chest, and you need a military tool chest, but we've done almost nothing with the educational tool chest. And for the cost of one American soldier in Afghanistan for 1 year, you can start around 20 schools. And I think you get an awful lot more benefit over the long run from those 20 schools. I think likewise in the US that poverty in America is incredibly complicated. And all kinds of pathologies that go with it are incredibly complicated. But it seems to me the best escalator out of poverty, whether you're talking about San Francisco or Pakistan or Sub-Saharan Africa, it is education. And so that would really be my focus that day.
Casey, what about on your day as president?
I truly don't know. That is a big job. I don't, in my regular journalism days, I don't think of myself as an advocacy journalist, so I'm really not used to talking about politics at all, and so I'm a little scared to do that.
Well, you don't have to answer
My
the
boss
question.
might be watching, so
Give me a call if that happens, though.
Yeah.
if I become president,
Yeah, when you become president, give me a call and
oh yeah, I'll put Nick on Sudan and hire a good team. That's what I would do.
Okay.
Hire people smarter than I am.
I know that you're limited to the kind of journalism you can do right now because you're a reporter covering local news for the Oregonian in Portland, and this is sort of the traditional starting point for working journalists. Looking like 10 or 15 years ahead, what kind of journalism would you like to be doing then?
I do try to do things in my job now, whether it doesn't have to be complete advocating, but I choose the stories that I want to do. And so I choose the kinds of people I want to talk to, I choose the situations that I want to go into. And so poverty issues are always going to be the most important to me, I think. I especially am really interested in doing stories on teenage boys in poverty, in part because it is a pretty amazing gift to give someone to put them in the newspaper usually, in a way that is...
Give us an example of a story that you assigned yourself and did and what effect it had.
The most recent one I did of a teenage boy was about a boxer who had never been in the newspaper before. And I don't really know how to explain it exactly, but it does feel like you're telling someone that they do matter and what they're doing is important and someone's watching them, so it makes them keep going. And or I don't know, this isn't about a teenage boy, but a couple of months ago I did a story. There's a group called Community Action that gives out rent assistance to people who can't pay their rent that month or who are about to be evicted. And this particular month was the worst month they had ever had. They had $7,000 to give out. And on the day of eviction day at 8 o'clock, they open up the phone lines for people to call and ask for money. If you call at 8 o'clock and 15 seconds, you are too late. And so I sat with these people who just listened to voicemail after voicemail of people crying. They misspelled their own names. They like stuttered through the whole thing because they could not pay their rent, and they could only tell like 7 people that they could get that money. And to top it all off, the 2 women who are doing the phone calls all day, they were being laid off that day. It was their last day because the organization didn't have the money to keep them. And these people work strictly based on donations if you give money to Community Action. So I wrote that story the best that I could, and it went on the front page of the Oregonian. And so then that lets people, they can donate. I can't donate to that organization or say, hey, everybody, go donate to this organization. But if you believe in that, then you can donate to it,
And did people donate as a result of your story?
I actually don't know. I'm not a good journalist, apparently, and did not follow up.
Might be worth doing.
I really do hope my boss is not watching.
Might be worth doing a follow-up story. Speaking of donating to organizations, Nick, I think you had a few things you wanted to say about that tonight, and there's some slides for suggestions of organizations to donate to that are doing the kind of work that you have talked about.
Yeah, we talked about what organizations, if people are moved, they might want to donate to. So we wanted to give you 3 options, and I think if you can show the first slide. The first is CARE, and basically the 3 organizations: 1 large, 1 medium, 1 small. CARE, terrific organization, does a lot of work on women and girls. And one strength of a large organization is that it tends to have good controls. It has, and there are some advantages in working on a whole bunch of issues simultaneously: on education, on health, on income generation, so that a community gets support in ways that feed on each other and build together. Then the next slide, if you can show it, is CAMFED, I believe. Is that CAMP? Yeah. CAMFED is the Campaign for Female Education, and this focuses on educating girls in Africa. And the great strength of that is this is something that essentially we know how to do. That educating girls is, it's not rocket science. This is something that has a great record, and it has so many benefits beyond education. Those educated girls will then grow up to be able to have better jobs, to generate income in ways that will support their children, that will support the families. It's not just about that individual. There's an African proverb that if you educate a boy, then you produce an educated man. If you educate a girl, then you raise the whole village. And there's something to that in terms of educating these girls. It also has a dramatic effect on birth rates. If you educate a boy, he'll have fewer children, but it's a pretty modest effect. You educate a girl, there's a dramatic effect on birth rates. So this is, educating girls is one of the most powerful things one can do, and that's what CAMFED's specialty is. And the last one is, the last slide should be Edna's maternity hospital. Yeah. Edna Adan she's one of my heroes. This is a woman, a Somali woman, who had a career with the World Health Organization and then retired, and she decided she was going to build a maternity hospital in her homeland, in Somaliland. And she did it by force of will, and with the financial support of some American, of a small number of Americans. She lives in that hospital in the top floor. She donates her pension, her WHO pension, to keep that hospital going. It is an amazing place, and it saves lives wholesale. She's also educating midwives throughout the region and fighting a campaign against female genital mutilation all out of that hospital. And so this is small scale. This is one hospital in one country, but it also means that for those women who manage to come to that hospital, it's completely transformative. I mean, she's saving hospital. My favorite story about Edna is one day when there's a gate at a metal gate at the compound, and inside a little open area in front of the hospital, and somebody drove in, and he said, my wife's giving birth in the back seat. My wife's giving birth, and Edna ran out, and she's about ready to, she's pulling the woman into the hospital, and then he says, "Oh, she just had the baby. Never mind." And Edna says, "No, you can't." And he tries to leave, and Edna says, "No, you can't go. We've got to get the placenta out." And he says, "No, I'm not gonna waste any time here at a hospital." And Edna says, "Close the gate." And this is an amazing woman. So there you have three options, all doing extraordinary work in different scale, different places, different fields. There's more information about them out here, I believe, and also I believe representatives of CARE and CAMFED as well.
And I think there are kiosks also where people can, or computers or something, where people can donate online. At this point, we'd like to open things up to questions from all of you. There are microphones, I believe, on each side. When you come forward and ask a question, please identify yourself, and also, since so many of you here are students or teachers, tell us what school you're from.
I'm going to start up here in the front.
Hi, my name is Zach. I'm from Menlo School. I was wondering if you think that Reddit is helpful.
What is helpful?
If Reddit.com
Oh, I see.
is helpful.
I confess I'm not a Reddit user. I've been thinking about Reddit as a way of marketing my own columns, but I've never. I haven't gotten to the point of spending time on Reddit, so I really don't know. So would Reddit be good for these purposes or for getting more readers for my columns? Yeah? Yeah, okay, well I'll check it out, and so if you see my columns there, then you were the inspiration.
The next question.
I've never used it either.
The next question's over here.
Hi, my name's Robin Brasso. I'm a retired teacher. And I am on a steering committee of women from various NGOs who would like to bring the Fifth World United Nations Women's Conference to San Francisco in 2015. There hasn't been one since Beijing. So I know you're talking about doing small things, and this would be a rather large thing. And I just want to know how you would feel about that.
I'm certainly not going to say in San Francisco that I'm against bringing it to San Francisco. I'm all in favor. I do think that the conferences have had some use in shining a light on these issues, but again, over time, I've really become more a believer in using political capital on some of the grassroots initiatives more than on the global ones.
Next question over here.
Hi, my name is Karen, and I teach at Oceana High School in Pacifica. And we do an exhibition project at the end of the sophomore year where we ask students to research current human rights abuse going on in the world outside the US, so sex trafficking, child labor, child soldiers, etc. And it's a really powerful project, but we've always been challenged to try to help our students feel empowered at the end of it and not just feel a sense of desperation or a sense that they can't do anything. And we've tried lots of different models, including looking for an organization like a sister school in another country, but it still doesn't have that sense of immediacy that we'd like our students to feel that they can actually make a difference. So I'm wondering if you have any suggestions for what we can do to help our students feel like they can do something to help.
One suggestion I guess I would have is if there's somebody in the community that you can find who has a connection with another country, who goes back periodically, still has family there, then to try to work through that person to do some specific project in that other country, and maybe supporting a particular school there, so that that individual who is here can meet with your class, can maybe arrange a Skype back with some people, and it just becomes very tangible and real if there is a individual who can talk about his hometown. In my in the school my kids go to, the high school my kids go to, there's one of the social studies teachers found a Ghanaian who has helped set up a project with in Ghana, and so that has become that kind of very powerful, kind of real thing because of that individual. So, not sure where you find that person, but I guess that would be what I would suggest if you can.
Next question up here.
Hi, my name's Jamie. I am a sometimes music teacher. I thought you guys would be interesting folks to ask about what you thought about Coney 2012.
Well, watching it certainly is really flashy, and I actually sat through the whole thing, which I think probably most foreign, if it were pretty dull, I probably wouldn't have watched a 20-minute video. And honestly, I know you took a ton of flack about your column in the Atlantic, and but I think it's exciting to me. I go to high schools in the Portland area, and they have Coney 2012 posters up, and I don't think it can be bad to have teenagers more excited to know what's going on or pushing them to know. And the idea that just because it's Africa, we shouldn't give ourselves white savior complexes, so we should just not do anything. That I just don't think it's so simple as that you can just say, I can't have a white savior complex, so I better not do anything. And there was a Jeffrey Gettleman article maybe like a week or two ago in the New York Times that America was out there in the CAR, actually, where we had been looking for Joseph Kony, and they interviewed a general, I think, who said, is this because of Coney 2012? Absolutely. And that's, a bunch of teenagers getting really excited, putting these posters up, wearing bracelets. And maybe bracelets don't ostensibly do any big thing, but I think having more people aware of militant leaders is always better.
That's exactly my take.
Next question over here.
Hi, I wanted to go back to something Nicholas said about the positive news stories. I wanted some of your ideas about why there isn't more stories that are positive of social change that's happening.
This is a good question. It's something I think about a lot. And basically, we in the news business, we're in the business of covering planes that crash, not the planes that take off. And so in the U.S., or then people sort of understand that. And so if we write about crime somewhere, then people, understand that there's a lot of houses that aren't getting robbed, a lot of banks that aren't being robbed, and this kind of thing. But when we cover Africa in particular, in terms of genocide in Darfur, mass rape in eastern Congo, turmoil in Ivory Coast, then I think there's a risk that readers will think, oh, Africa is this big mass of genocide, rape, conflict, and in a way that is profoundly misleading. I mean, the truth is that Africa is now the fastest growing part of the world. Much of it has had dramatically improved governance. And I sometimes do worry that because, if you look at my reporting, it's been Sudan, Darfur, it's been Eastern Congo, and, rape and killings and this kind of thing. And it's been, kids dying of bad water and disease and so on. And so, I'm part of exactly the problem I'm talking about. But then on the other hand, I think, here we are in Eastern Congo, you've had millions and millions of people killed. It's the most lethal conflict since World War II. There have been fewer column inches devoted to each million deaths there than there have to any other conflict. And we think we should, cover it less. It's that I shouldn't go to Eastern Congo, I should go to, to Ghana. So that's the trade-off for me. And the way I try to bridge it is for example, on each Win a Trip, we'll do a a series of visits and a series of columns focused on whatever, malnutrition, conflict, whatever, but I do try to do one to try to set the scene and say that, actually there is a tremendous amount of progress. But it's, I think it's a real structural problem with the way we cover the world and cover news. And I'm still puzzling about how to deal with it.
Next question's up here.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Burton. And Nick, I know that a lot of your work is focused on human trafficking. I wanted, hoping that you could take a moment and talk about some of the work that you're doing about Backpage.
Backpage, for those who don't know, backpage.com is a website where you can buy a bit of everything, and they have an adult area, including escort ads, that is now the major site for prostitution ads in this country. Last count, 81% of online prostitution advertising is on Backpage.com. Now some of those ads are placed by adult women who aren't being pimped, who end up having consensual sex with somebody else. A lot of the ads are placed by pimps, and many of them involve underage girls. And in at least 22 states, you've now had these underage girls rescued who've been advertised on Backpage. Just about every case you come across anywhere in the country involving underage girls being rescued from pimps, that girl has been marketed on Backpage. And the attorney generals from 48 states have called on Backpage to get out of this business. They have resisted, and so I've been taking whacks at them periodically. I think at the end of the day it's going to come down to whether they're going to lose more advertising from other publications they control. It's owned by Village Voice Media, which also owns Village Voice and many other regional, local alternative papers. They lose more advertising in those than the roughly $23 million a year they get from the prostitution advertising. Then they'll change. It's about money. And their advertisers are beginning to drop it, but I must say that it's maybe, I don't know, a dozen or 2 dozen advertisers that have dropped it. And this has been a campaign involving months. When Rush Limbaugh made his utterly offensive comments, immediately 100 advertisers dropped him. And it strikes me as infinitely more offensive to be selling 14-year-old girls that are being pimped out, and I wish the advertisers would respond as readily.
Next question over here.
Hi, I'm Leva Whitbeck, and I teach physics at the Jewish Community High School, and my question is about personal psychology. So if you know about terrible things that are happening to real people and you feel the reality of the real people to whom these terrible things are happening, how do you be in that every day without getting hard-hearted or overwhelmed?
I do become hard-hearted. I mean, there's no doubt about it. I get numb to things. In Darfur, I mean, I used to sort of catch myself, but it'd be in Darfur. You get to a village, it'd be scary. You don't know where the Janjaweed militia is, and you want to, as quickly as possible, not only for your own safety, but for the safety of your interpreter and your driver, you want to get the most compelling story you can from that village and then get out. And so, you go to one person and, ask who's been shot or raped or whatever, and you say, okay, well, here's a 40-year-old man, and, well, he was shot in the leg, and you think, okay, I can do better. And so you say, okay, I'm sorry, I just don't have time to get your story. And then you go off and, you find a 6-year-old girl who's been shot in the stomach or something. And then, you feel terrible turning away from people who have horrific stories, but I really do catch myself getting numbed and inured to some degree to that kind of horror that you're exposed to. It's also a protective mechanism, frankly. And one of the reasons I wanted to have the Win a Trip contest, frankly, was that I felt I was, to some degree, numb to some of this, and it'd be useful to bring somebody with fresh eyes to bring that perspective to this kind of reporting.
Casey, how did you feel on this issue when you were on the trip?
Well, I initially when we were doing this Prudence story, I remember like it was really hard for me not to cry, and I really didn't want to cry in front of Nick Kristof. I didn't want to seem like a bad journalist, like the kind who would be emotionally caught up in something. And I remember going outside and I was like, do not cry. Do not cry. Casey, don't cry. And I failed that. I still cried. But we were only there 2 weeks, and by the end, at the village where Nick left the army at the farmer's market, when we first got there, I was kind of like, ugh, this is no big deal. They have powdered milk and a goat, and that was only 2 weeks. And already I was like, let's get into the bush. We can find a better story than this. So after decades, I'm not sure, but I mean, I think you have to find someone that you can talk to about those things to process them. And we have like a cops reporter and a court reporter who sit right next to me, who are always covering murders and abuses, and they have each other, and they really talk through those things, and I think that's really helpful.
The next question's up in the back.
Hi, my name's Elijah. I also go to the Jewish Community High School of the Bay, and all of you are welcome to come and speak there, by the way. But my question is, Mr. Kristof, you talked a lot about kind of the role of grassroots organizations in affecting change, and I was wondering when larger government organizations, or just larger organizations in general, when it becomes necessary to involve those in affecting change.
I think some health campaigns are a great example of that. I mean, maybe the most successful single thing that has ever been done against poverty was the campaign to eradicate smallpox. This took about 10 years. I think it cost $120 million, and it has had $17 billion in savings since. You have a disease that has been wiped out, and that is something that could only have been done by governments working together in conjunction with the UN. The campaign to eradicate polio right now, same thing. But even those sort of top-down campaigns, you also need the grassroots knowledge and wisdom, and people just listening to people at the grassroots. For example, efforts to eradicate female genital mutilation. You'd think that would be something that would be best be done by governments passing laws to abandon it, but those laws have been passed in country after country and have had almost no effect, while the grassroots campaigns against it have actually worked to some degree.
Last two questions.
Hi, I'm a university student at the University of San Francisco, and I actually just finished reading your book, Half the Sky, in which you say that one of the paramount moral challenges in this century is gender inequality in the developing world. And tonight you've already mentioned, Rush Limbaugh's quotes about, calling the girl a slut, and the conservatives' so-called war on women, and then I think of, the recent Planned Parenthood debacle, and I wonder if such a focus on the so-called third world is dangerous in a sense that it makes us blind to the less overt gender equalities that are maybe present in our own society, and in an assumption that we are modern and we are not, I don't know. Is that a critique that you receive of your book, and if so, how would you address that?
Yeah, I think it's actually kind of a critique that we make about the book. I think if we were doing it again, we would probably have more about the U.S. I do think that there are profound differences between the challenges women face in this country versus those they face abroad. And the simplest, in a sense, the simplest index of gender inequality is the sex ratio of the population. That in countries like the U.S., there are more females than males, because given equal access to food and healthcare, women live longer. And so the discrimination here isn't lethal. Worldwide, there are actually more males than females in the world, because in so much of the world, discrimination is lethal. And that's kind of one way of distinguishing those countries where discrimination is worse, those where it's not as bad. Having said that, I think the two biggest problems in this country, for women, in terms of affecting the most number of people, are issues that don't always get on the radar so much, but one is indeed trafficking and domestic trafficking. We tend to think of trafficking as involving foreign women smuggled into the U.S. That is indeed part of the problem, but the biggest part of it is domestic, homegrown girls who typically are the wrong side of the tracks, often girls of color, and they end up being pimped, and the police, are not there to help. The police arrest them. And the other big problem like that is domestic violence. And again, a huge problem around the country. And I think we can do a lot more on both those.
The next question is over here.
Hello. When you spoke about Edna, it's a very nice example of how men are completely unaware of is there something done in Africa to make men aware of what is happening rather than women? Because the women know what is happening. They don't need anybody telling them. So I was just wondering whether something is done to make the men aware, not only aware, but not ashamed to act on what they have learned.
Good question. But let me push back a little bit. I think there is sometimes an assumption that because terrible things happen to women, because women are brutally oppressed and trafficked and have their genitals cut and a million other things, that the problem is men. And it's so much more complicated than that. Worldwide, most of the traffickers are not men, they're women. In this country, pimps tend to be male. In most of the world, they're female, because a female is going to have a better luck in recruiting a girl from a village and saying she's going to help her when actually she's going to sell her to a brothel. The people who make decisions about genital cutting, those are the mothers and the grandmothers, and the men are pretty much, depending on the country, out of that decision making. If you ask people their views about wife beating, good thing, bad thing, then the best predictor of the answer is not the gender of the person. The best predictor is the education level of the person and whether they live in a city or a rural area. Generally, urban people and better educated people think wife beating is a bad idea, while more rural people and less educated people, women included, think, what did she do? So I think, clearly the problem is sort of patriarchal and often misogynistic attitudes, but those are values that can be absorbed and transmitted almost as readily by women as by men. Having said that, there are some problems like trafficking that would go away if there weren't men trying to buy sex. And certainly that is an area that one can do a lot with. And indeed, in terms of trafficking, one of the great pioneers of that was the John School set up here in San Francisco, which has now been being copied all over the country, where Johns are brought in and they are kind of told what trafficking is really about, often by survivors of trafficking. And it has had a real impact on them and made them much less likely to buy sex a second time. It's one of the reasons why Cheryl and I wrote the book together, that we really think that there's a misperception sometimes that this is basically just kind of a women's problem. This is the Holocaust wasn't just a Jewish issue, civil rights weren't just a black issue, and when you have all these things happening to women around the world, it's not just a women's issue, it's a human rights issue for men and women together to try to address.
So I'm afraid that's all we have time for, but I want to thank very much Nick and Casey for being here tonight, and invite you all to join us for the reception afterwards, reception and book signing, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you.